going to talk about introducing data downtime and the path from firefighting to winning. I'll explain shortly what that means. A little bit about myself. I've been the Vice President of Customer Operations at Gainsight for the last couple of years. Gainsight is a customer data company. Prior to that, I was at Bain & Company as a management consultant. Before that, I was also in the Israeli Air Force as a commander of a data analyst unit. And the most important thing to know about me is that I am a diehard fan of Bruce Willis, every single movie. Come talk to me about that after. So I want to tell you guys a story about actually a pretty difficult time for me professionally. This was back in 2016. I don't know if this is familiar to anyone, but at the time at Gainsight, I see heads nodding, that's good. At the time at Gainsight, I was leading a team responsible for customer data and analytics. And part of our responsibility, we actually had dashboards and metrics that went regularly to the board, to our executives, and to our customers as well. And I think there was like this three-week period where literally it was like the perfect storm. I think like it felt like every week I woke up to like 10 different emails about something else that went wrong with the data. This could be anywhere from like engineering pushed new code, which had a bug, which impacted the specific dashboard, to someone made a change in the field name, really just like a myriad of things that just all went wrong at the same time. And I think the thing that was hardest for us as a team was that we were never actually the team catching this, right? It was actually like other people letting us know about this, people from like folks from our CEO to actually customers. And that was really frustrating, actually. I wasn't sure we're going to get out of it. But after basically like 10 days of work, working straight through the weekend, my team remembers this time, we were able to reach a stabilized point. Now, our CEO at the time was very patient, but some CEOs are not as patient. I met a founder, a CEO, who told me that he regularly, like on a weekly basis, goes around the office with sticky notes saying like this is wrong, and like posts this on data with analytics. So you get both extremes. So in any case, it sounds like this is a familiar thing, and for anyone who's actually in data for a while, this sort of actually becomes like kind of like the state of the norm, right? We sort of like accepted it. Yeah, this is part of like what it's like to deal with data, right? And there are some good articles on Medium talking about this and getting more and more traction. And honestly, this happens to like teams both small and large, right? Like this is just from a month ago. Google's bad data wiped another neighborhood off the map. But yeah, pretty hilarious, right? But like, I guess our data is 100% reliable, like said no one ever, right? So what are we actually doing about this? Some teams, try to find like creative ways to hand this problem over to someone else, right? The data engineers are like, no, this is a data analyst problem. The data scientists are like, no, this is a data analyst problem. And the executives are like, what's going on, right? So some teams do actually like start to proactively think about this, actually like will add some manual checks and tests. And teams that are really, want to get around this problem will spend significant amount of resources and time. This is an example of someone who's worked on this for a company that's worked on this for an entire year to actually reach this stabilization point. That's a significant investment from a company perspective. So what I'd like to actually propose here is that while this problem is really prevalent, a lot more prevalent than we care to admit, I don't think that we're actually treating it with the diligence that it demands. And I think maybe it's part of like the stigma of having wrong data that we're trying to avoid. Like, it sort of feels uncomfortable to get on stage and say, oh man, my data was really wrong for a while there, and And I do think in order to get around this and to really address this problem, we have to start talking about it. And I'd like to propose a new name for it that actually, I think, gives it the gravity that it deserves. I'd like to call it data downtime. So data downtime refers to periods of time when your data is partial, erroneous, missing, or just otherwise inaccurate. Now, why data downtime? Borrowing sort of from the concept of the early internet days. So going back a couple decades ago, when the internet was new, having your website up was like not such a big deal. Maybe you had an online application, maybe not, right? And so if your online application was down, it just wasn't a big deal. Like you could afford that, right? Fast forward to today, like no such thing, right? Like everybody's like meticulously measuring downtime and uptime of their online applications. And companies invest a lot of effort in making sure that everything is running at all times. So I'd like to propose that in the same way, if you guys, at the point that we are now today in time, if you guys fast forward a couple of decades from now, I think we're going to see that we're going to have to treat data in the same way that we've treated online applications back then. I think data is going to become much more critical to our day-to-day operations. We're going to rely on it similar in the same way that we rely on our online applications. And we're going to have to meticulously invest in actually figuring out how to make sure that our data is up and valid and accurate. So in this talk, I'll cover a little bit about what I think about the risks are of data downtime. I got a lot of nods here, so it sounds like it's sort of familiar. Maybe if you can just do like a quick raise of hand, like who experienced data downtime in their company at some point or in the past? Yeah, that's like 100%. And yet we're all sort of, I don't want to say complacent, but we've kind of accepted it, right? So I want to talk about why I think this is important. And I'll sort of show you guys from kind of my perspective what companies are doing to address this today. And I'd love to get your thoughts after if there's like any other amazing solutions that you guys know of. So a couple of signs that you're experiencing data downtime. Time spent on fire drills. I actually talked to a CTO of a marketing tech company who told me that his entire engineering team consists of about 200 engineers, spend something like 30% or more of their time, and I'm talking like weeks and days, not just hours, on fire drills. That's a significant drain. Now, that doesn't actually count for the morale impact that this has, right? That's another sort of area that we probably want to think about and quantify. Another example is actually an ad tech company that basically charges their customers based on their usage. They got the usage wrong. They found this out a couple of months later, which basically translated to them undercharging the customer by a couple $1 million. That's really significant, right? That's a big deal. Netflix in 2015 was down for 45 minutes in some parts. That's pretty bad, right? And so that was actually due to duplicate data. And I'll talk a little bit more about what they put in place in order to deal with that. Another example here is actually a debt collection company that basically relies on data from third-party organizations to give them information about debt to collect. You can imagine how every delay or problem with that data, not in a span of like a couple of hours of troubleshooting, but actually a couple of minutes, in which they don't actually know who to collect money from and how much, that's a significant impact for them. So they actually measure the troubleshooting time in minutes, not in hours and not in days. Actually, another person I talked to told me that their data analysts spend so much time troubleshooting that they started tracking the numbers, quantifying it, and then putting it back into costs for the product team to account for. So basically, like product team was accountable for that metric. So really creative ways kind of to get around this, but I think you guys sort of hopefully get the sense that this is kind of beyond one team or one organization. It's really impacting our ability to sort of deliver meaningful value to our clients and also to help our teams internally. So what can we do about it? As I mentioned, I really believe that this is a very big problem. I think we talk a lot about like privacy and security and self-service analysis, self-service analytics, and a lot of other things that we can do with data, but fundamentally, if we don't get the data right, that's a problem for everyone, right? And that's actually like, I think it's one of the biggest barriers, if not the biggest one, to the data industry as a whole. And I'd propose that, for us here who are passionate about the data industry, actually make this part of our agenda, make this part of our day-to-day operations, figure out what your data debt is and actually pay it. Have this part of your weekly meetings, part of your agenda, maybe even part of your roadmap. Another way is to actually think about data downtime as a good way to measure your team's effectiveness, if you guys are actually responsible for data. Many times I talked to folks who told me, wow, we've improved so much in our data capabilities over time, but we don't really have a way to show that, right? We don't have a way to explain how our team can shine. So if you guys go back to your teams and actually figure out a way to measure this and then to show progress for data downtime over time, that's an amazing way to showcase how your team is shining in the organization and bringing value. So in the last couple of months, sort of thinking through what I call sort of a maturity model for data downtime. So this is based on kind of conversation with hundreds of companies dealing with data downtime, and trying to classify what's actually kind of the journey that people go through as they deal with this. And a couple of interesting patterns. And I hope that as we go through this, a couple of things for you guys to keep in mind. So one, where would you place yourself, right? Like, I'm super curious. If I could do a survey, maybe ask you guys at the end, like, how many folks are in which stage? How much attention do you guys actually put to this? And then the second thing to keep in mind is, what are some of the tools that other teams are doing, the things that other folks are thinking about that you want to take back to your organization and to implement? So the very first stage is sort of the reactive stage. That's kind of the stage where you're really kind of in this ongoing crisis mode, right? Like, every day there's another email, there's lots of stuff coming. You're really kind of like running around like headless chickens trying to figure out what's going on. Once you sort of figure out that you have a problem, you move to the proactive stage, right? In the proactive, you're actually starting to put together some pretty basic manual checks. It requires discipline, this part. It actually, unfortunately, requires a lot of folks to change the way that they operate and make sure that they include this in your code and your processes. And then once you sort of figure out that you want to take it to the next level, the automated stage is where you actually have greater coverage and are thinking about this in a more programmatic way and more automatic way. The last stage is really when it comes to sort of substantial coverage. It's a lot more about kind of managing all of your different data sources and data types, and really having more of an embedded way to validate the data and to make sure that you don't have data downtime. So I'll walk through examples of what teams do in each of these. I'm going to skip the reactive stage because it's just a painful one. But you guys can just assume that there's not much going on in the reactive stage. One thing actually that's interesting is I spoke to lots of folks who told me, like, I hear this a lot, in my previous two companies, we were reactive all the time. Like, really reactive. And now I'm in a new company. This is my first role here, and this is going to be the first thing that I'm going to get right. Like, I'm not going to repeat the mistakes that I made in the past too. And I think that's awesome. Like, I think that's really cool. That means you can skip the first couple of ones all the way from the beginning. That's huge value add. So a couple of examples for what folks do in the proactive stage. So starting out with pretty basic, these are just examples, kind of to give you guys a taste of what it's like. Obviously, there's a lot more out there. But a couple of examples. One is pretty basic best practice. Say you have a weekly dashboard that your board or executives you're using every week. You want to make sure that you're generating the data a couple of times that week, so that if there's an issue, you can catch and recover from it pretty quickly. Another thing that folks do is manually actually write QA queries. For example, on timestamps to make sure that the data is fresh. If you're sort of generating data from different sources, making sure that there is a source of truth at this point. And then doing something like validating row counts in critical parts of your pipeline. And I'll walk through an example of that. So this is sort of an example of kind of a pretty basic architecture, typical architecture, where you have a data source, or maybe a couple of data sources. This can be like usage data, or customer or transaction data, or website visits. And then you sort of have a job to kind of send that to data warehouse. That can be something like Redshift or Snowflake. And then you have a couple of jobs to then do transformation, aggregations on the data. And essentially what you can do is basically validate something really basic, like just the number of rows for your key tables, those that either tend to break most often or those that you're sort of watching or using most commonly in your decisions, to make sure that that's within reasonable range that you'd expect. One thing to consider here that I think is pretty interesting is whether you actually fail the job, completely sort of stop the transmission of data versus generate a warning and alert, continue to send the data, but have someone actually look at it to make sure that it's within reason, and you can sort of continue with your normal operations. So that's just trade-offs to think about. Now, if you want to take this to the next step, you can actually track more things than row counts. You can track a set of metrics. You can store them in a centralized place like Influx as sort of a time series database, and then actually create some sort of centralized place that you can then drive visibility off of it. So this is, if you guys can have like a dashboard that you look at this and create reporting and even alerting on this. So when is this actually effective to do? Well, it's effective when row count actually matters to your data, and row count is a good predictive measure of issues. If you guys think, I think some teams, this can help catch 40 or 50% of the really big problem. The limitation is that obviously this is manual. It requires maintenance and tuning, and obviously doesn't catch all the issues. Definitely it's not sensitive to season. It is sensitive to seasonality, so something to consider. So then in the third stage, the more automated stage, where it's more programmatic way of thinking and designing this, also starts enforcement of specific behaviors that you would expect or not expect. So starting by, first of all, tracking a set of metrics and also tracking them automatically, so it doesn't require sort of the manual effort or less of it, about dimensions and measures, and then starting to look at those, tracking those historically, basically looking at metadata over time and comparing to past periods to see if there's something that you need to be concerned about. Some team have a data health dashboard that they report on every week, that they look at every week. It can be something simple like red, yellow, green to just explain whether you're making progress or not. And then starting to think more about data downtime beyond a particular team. So I think the minute that you start sort of documenting and creating a centralized place for everyone to see how you align on the data, it allows you to take it out of your particular team, whether that's data engineering or data analyst or data scientist team, and then expand it to the entire organization. So by having visibility, it actually helps you rally other teams around this and helps you communicate that this is an important thing that we want to figure out. So I think that's the big sort of benefit of documentation here. And then sort of another good example, I think, is sort of both monitoring and enforcing schema and validity of upstream. So talk about that one for a bit. So why would you want to do this? What are some of the reasons? Perhaps it's obvious, but data sources change. They can be, a schema change. Data sources can get added, can be updated, can be dropped. I think if there's one constant thing that we can all say about our data is that it just never stays the same, right? We always keep on adding, updating it. And so that's just the reality. The second thing is that often the data team doesn't have visibility into what's happening upstream. I think a lot of teams have improved on that. I talked to this company that told me, we make such a big deal of every change that engineering makes that it's like the biggest announcement, almost like we closed a new customer or like made a really big change in our feature. Like literally the engineering team goes out to the entire organization and announces to the data organization and announces it. They do RCAs on root cause analysis on every data issue, really sort of make data issue part of the engineering culture as well. How do you actually do that? So starting by defining the expected schema, and then actually validating against the schema before processing new data, and then probably either allowing the user or making a decision about whether you want to totally discard the data send it to a separate isolated database and or alert on it. So this is a tool that Segment released not too long ago. It's called Protocols. I think this tool actually started because they notice that their customers are doing this documentation of schema in Excel, like literally typing in. Maybe some of you guys are doing that as well. I certainly did that. And so they realized, why don't we help automate that and actually take it to the next level and allow folks to enforce the schema that they've defined in Excel. So this is an example of a tracking plan where you basically can have define your events, a description of what those are, specify what data type, like a string or an integer, I think they have there, or a number, and basically create visibility so that everyone sort of is aligned on this. And then, as I mentioned, what you can also do is that whenever sort of before you're processing data, if there's invalid or unplanned events, you can basically decide to take action based on that. You can either alert on that, discard it, or just send it to another database. So I think this is pretty cool. Like for folks using, I think it's pretty nifty. The limitations of it is obviously that it works for segment data. So for data that you're not processing in Segment, you still have to think about that. So taking this to the next level, as a bonus, moving beyond validating your structure of the data to actually validating the content of the data. So this is an example of a pretty cool open source tool called Great Expectations. I think actually Abe Gong is going to be here tomorrow. So if you guys have questions, you can ask this. You can ask him. But I think I think this is a really cool. Really cool open source. Encourage you guys to check it out. And basically what it allows you to do is encode in Python expectations that you have about the data. And then basically like understand and align on whether your data falls in place with that, with those expectations. So in this example, you basically declare your expectation about column values to be between a specific range and what's the allowed percentage of data that you're expecting to not be in range, or that's okay to not be in range. So for example, if you have a group of 10 people and you're looking at shirt sizes and you expect shirt sizes to be between 0 and 7, and you think up to 70% of the data needs to be within that range, you can define that in code and then run your data on it. I think the limitations of this, or the challenges of this, is first of all, it requires you to actually really understand your data, which you'd be surprised doesn't always happen, right? Or takes time, especially if you're just getting started. The second limitation is that it is manual and requires you to update it if your data set changes, if there's seasonality. So just something to consider. Another bonus, for teams who are thinking about actually creating alerts based on this, sort of like the nightmare scenario is when there's like this one person who's like bombarded by all these alerts, or maybe it's a certain team and then there starts kind of alert fatigue. You're not sure if the alert is right or not. Like, am I right? Is the alert right? Am I wrong? What's going on? And actually like going through all of them can be quite tedious. For teams who want to figure out how to streamline some of this, they would actually take a shot at sort of at the lineage and assign ownership at the beginning, so that every kind of assign ownership to like specific pipeline or specific tables, so that you can actually send the alert to the right person from the get-go. Cool. So that was the first 3 stages. In the 4th stage here, this is kind of taking it from, we moved from sort of manual checks to more programmatic, holistic way to think about it, to then actually doing this at scale. So one thing that you could start thinking about is actually validating these measures across different tables, meaning if you are looking at something like revenue, if you're trying to calculate revenue in a couple of different places, you'd expect revenue to correlate across all of those places. And so starting to track that can be really helpful. Another thing that people are starting to do is actually like track and annotate issues. So for example, if I was looking into something, into a particular data issue, like let's say our data dropped 3 years ago due to some world crisis actually that happened, I'd like to annotate that so that the next person will know, and that they're not going to come to me again and again for the question. And if I'm not there, which is always the case, it's always like the question, the person that you're looking for is never there. It's like Murphy's Law. And another thing that you can do is also start actually like tracking questions. I think Airbnb has a nice platform for this, where you can basically see like what questions folks asked and track that. As I mentioned, some teams are actually starting to use Jira for this, so have like runbooks, have like priority P1, P2, P3 to data issues, and really treat them in the same way that they would treat like an issue or a bug. And then finally here, embed automated data validation across your pipeline. I'll show a couple examples. The idea here is, again, sort of having this part of your ongoing operations and having it scalable as much as possible. So this is an example that was developed in eBay, Apache Griffin. It's an example of a very scalable way to do this. So basically, there are some pre-built tests that you can use, but it also allows you to define your own measures and your own metrics. You can run this on both batch and streaming, see Kafka. And basically, you have automatic reports and measurements generated for you, which you can then build alerts on top of. So it's pretty cool. The limitations of this, I think, are in that it does actually, a part of it does actually require defining the data quality measures that you're looking for. But last I believe they were running this on, I think, 800 million records a day, which is pretty insane. Yeah, this is just, I think, a very cool example of how to do this programmatically and at scale. And this is another example from Netflix, which I heard gave a great talk today. So this is, Netflix, as you know, in their instance, actually the requirement here is to validate like tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of metrics, and you can't really not account for seasonality. I don't know if there's like, who's watching video, I don't know, like Friday night, everything spikes, and then Monday morning, right? Or, specific month of the year, et cetera. It's actually really important to account for seasonality. So Netflix developed a RAD, robust anomaly detection. They published this online, you can check it out. Basically, what they do is it's pretty cool, they use an RPCA, robust PCA algorithm to detect anomalies. What you see here on the left side is actually a random data set and the algorithm based on it. And the circles there are actually the anomalous points. So first of all, I think it's a pretty cool way of detecting anomalies. The second thing is that, and I think this is the coolest part, is that they actually use a pig wrapper that allows folks to basically, with one line of code, include this in their pipelines and validate key metrics. So I think that's awesome. And that basically gets you out of the sort of manual part of it and allows you to have it really embedded and easy to use. I think also the specific examples that they've seen success in this is pretty cool. So as you can imagine, Netflix processes millions of transactions from banks across the world. And so they actually use this to identify at the bank level specific transactions that they need to address. And then folks can actually reach out to sort of their payment counterparts and address those specific issues. And they're doing it in a very scalable way. The second example is, so as you can imagine, Netflix users basically sign up to Netflix in very different devices, different browsers, different countries. And so they can use this to look at combinations of user, country, and browser to identify, like at the user level, what sign-up problems happen. So they can improve their sign-up conversion rates, basically, and address those anomalies or failures. So bringing this all together, I'm actually really curious. Maybe we can do like a quick show of hands. We'll see if you guys, how shy are you guys today? Who would put themselves in the reactive stage? Nice. Either you or a friend. You can answer for a friend, okay? Who sees himself or a friend in the proactive stage? Okay, about, I want to say 40%. We had like 10% or so in reactive, 34% proactive. How many in the automated stage? Ooh, interesting. What is this? 15%? Something like that? Pretty cool. How many in the scalable? One. You saved us. That's amazing. Very cool. Well, look, I hope this was helpful in sort of understanding where you guys are, but also sort of figuring out like where you want to be in the future, right? Like where do you think your company needs to be? So I would suggest that you guys like figure out where we are, where I am today, where I need to be, and how do I get there? Figure out like what are the tools, open source or not, that you want to incorporate that. Take that and put that as part of your roadmap, right? Like treat it with the diligence and the seriousness that's required, and let me know how it goes because I'm really curious. If you do figure this out, you will kick ass. No, I'm kidding. First of all, allows you to minimize fire drills, but more importantly, direct that time and energy towards revenue-generating features, towards other high priority, high critical and high priority items. It'll also actually help you gain a competitive advantage against others in the market in enabling your entire company to become data-driven. I think there's nothing worse than like an executive team or even a whole company that's trying to become data-driven. This founder told me a couple of months ago that they really wanted to be data-driven, but they were just so plagued by data issues that people were like, the data's wrong and this sucks, like we just don't want to really use this and we'll just go with our intuition, which I think happens a lot. So if you guys actually figure this out, this will truly enable you guys to deliver better value for your customers. And actually, I think something that's like contrary to popular belief, I think if you do this well, it doesn't actually slow you down with a lot of overhead, but rather allows you to move faster because you're more confident that you're not actually breaking everything along the way. And you get to say, I crushed it. So I'd love for the key takeaway, or the key takeaway that I have here is, despite great efforts from super smart people, many great teams, I think data downtime is still a challenge and still something that happens everywhere. And I think there are actually many hard unsolved problems here and a great opportunity. And I do think that if we rally together around this and sort of figure it out, it's going to be a huge benefit, not just for your companies and teams, but also for the data industry as a whole. So I think we have just a couple of minutes. I can take questions in office hours to let folks get to lunch. But thanks so much, guys.
Yeah, I have one. So this journey really resonates with me. So I work for LinkedIn. We have done a lot of work to reduce our data downtime. I think, and as the data science data that we produce has gotten more reliable and robust and valuable, now other teams have started relying on our data, and so we break them just like the engineering teams used to break us.
Nice.
And a question that I have, I think something that's still remaining very difficult is knowing who the consumers of your data are and how they are using it to figure out who to notify. So we can blast out notifications to everyone, this thing is going to change. But if we knew this is the person who uses this field in the way that we are about to break them, we could, pin them down and warn them more effectively.
Yeah.
Any advice on that?
Totally. Great question. It's funny how you always find yourself on like both sides, right? It's an easy transition. And so first of all, I will say I don't think there's a silver bullet. At least I haven't seen one. If anyone has, let me know. But I don't think there's a silver bullet. I think folks we're still figuring that out. There's obviously data lineage solutions that people are starting to develop. I also know teams who, in a very manual and process-oriented way, have like weekly check-ins with folks from each of these organizations to talk about what are the main changes that are coming up, and sort of like the headline of what's the area that you want to be thoughtful about. So that's one way to think about that. Another way that folks are starting to think about this is, as you mentioned, like the blasting warnings, but I think that works for smaller teams, certainly not for LinkedIn. So yeah, some ideas, but I just don't think that there's a silver bullet yet.
Hi, I really loved this talk. Absolutely resonated with me as well. So my name's Claire. I work at Fishtown Analytics, and I'm the DBT community manager. And I'm not sure if you've heard of DBT, but I just kind of wanted to very quickly talk about it because these are things that we think about a lot. So DBT helps analysts do like the transformations in their warehouse. And in terms of some of these problems, like when we write our SQL, you can also write tests on your SQL. Anything that you can express as a SQL query, you know, things are unique, things are not null, how many row counts there are, like is just a YAML file for us. So any of the clients we work with, we've got some of our some community members who use DBT sitting next to me from Envoy, over at GitLab, Periscope in the back there.
Nice.
And we have a really good framework around, you know, running your tests when you submit a pull request, running your tests after every single set of transformations. In our latest version that we released a couple of weeks ago, we also introduced a concept of sources where you could test the data that's being put in your warehouse as well, not just your transformations, and also test how fresh it is. So the next release as well, we're going to be adding more fine-grained controls to that. What's a warning, what's an error? So this is something that I think about a lot, and I think, yeah, I just wanted to share. Like,
Nice.
we've got a few other people in the room that use it as well, so
Yeah,
feel free to ask
I need a
questions.
slide for you guys next time. I think that's what I'm hearing.
Yes, please. That's pretty much my goal.
Sounds good. Awesome.
All right. Thank you so much for your talk. Definitely resonated. A lot of, well, co-founding a startup, but I think a lot of my recent experience has been leading data teams for companies that are at Series B or earlier. So one of the kind of the opposite of the LinkedIn problem, right? Like the product itself that we're instrumenting and measuring and analyzing is changing week to week. So the schemas are changing, the semantics of the data are changing. Do you have any advice as to how to approach that problem, especially in a context where the ratio of data staff to product staff is close to 0?
Yeah. Yeah, great question. So I think it's interesting because there's like maybe 3 or 4 things changing at once. Like your company is changing. So like your team is changing basically, right? Like probably you guys are, if you're growing fast, probably you guys are hiring a lot. You have new team members. By the way, everything that, like, there's probably like one data engineer, maybe at some point, and like then he or she left. So like there's all the changes that, right, with the team itself and the people. The product is changing, as you mentioned, very quickly, right? And the data is changing. So the way that you guys are thinking about data sources or your data infrastructure is changing all the time. I think that is actually true to almost all companies, maybe some a little bit differently on the people side, but actually like even large companies are growing their data team pretty quickly is what I found in specific areas. And companies who are trying to become more data driven. So the good news is that you're not alone. I think lots of companies experience this change regardless of their stage. The less bad news is, again, like I don't have a silver bullet. I think what people do today is figure out how important this is to them and then put their resources behind to figure that out. So for example, if you have someone who's at the sort of executive level to make sure that it is a top company priority. I think the problem is that many times it's like number 15 on the list for someone, and then it never actually gets the right resources and not prioritized. So I think having someone who's responsible and accountable for it. I mean, the other thing is that also like there isn't only one person accountable for this, and whenever there's more than one person, it's like there's zero accountability. So actually having one person who's tasked at figuring this out, the person like wakes up every day and like thinks obsessively about it, like how to do this better. I think that can also be meaningful. And then I'd say the last thing is like charting out a roadmap and figuring out like what's the state today, what do we need to do, and how are we getting there, and charting that way. That would be my recommendation.